Okay, so Final Fantasy 16 obviously is a game that at this point it's safe to say that it has sold poorly in comparison to its predecessor, which came out back in 2016, Final Fantasy 15. And honestly, I think the reason why Final Fantasy 16 fell below desired expectations mainly because it came out in a year where there was so much competition and so much high profile video game releases. And as far as the RPG genre is concerned, Baldur's Gate 3 is pretty much the best video game of the year, best RPG game of the year. Um, I feel like Final Fantasy 16 for the most part became an afterthought after a couple of months because I believe it was reported like a couple of months after its release that it did like 3 million in terms of sales. And even though that sounds like good on paper, if you look at Final Fantasy 15 when it came out back in 2016, it sold like 5 million copies on its first day. And then you look at Final Fantasy 13, which I believe came out like in '09 or whatever, it did like 3 mil in its first week. So the thing is, as far as the newer entries are concerned, it seems like more people are losing interest in the Final Fantasy series, or it's not necessarily something that casuals are really as interested in as they once were. And honestly, like the sales performance of Final Fantasy 16 ended up being so detrimental to Square Enix to a point where their stock had actually went down. And at the same time, Square Enix was heavily relying on Final Fantasy 16 to pretty much to make up for the loss of profits that they had um, from Marvel's Avengers and Forspoken, and those were two games that Square Enix was heavily promoting before their releases, and they ended up like flopping and failing big time. And there's a lot of people in the company who are pretty much blaming different people for um, like the failure of the last couple of high profile games they had. Like employees are like blaming the company producers and all that stuff for like having too much control of the projects and whatever. But yeah, I mean, Square Enix right now doesn't have too much going for them other than the fact that they have Final Fantasy VII Rebirth that's supposed to be coming out next year at some point. And I believe Final Fantasy 14 is supposed to be getting a new expansion sometime in the future as well. Right now, Final Fantasy 16 is a PS5 exclusive, and there's like a PC version that's currently in development. And honestly, I think that's one of the things that actually hurt Final Fantasy 16 was the fact that it was a PS5 exclusive. Because I believe when Final Fantasy 15 was released back in 2016, it came out for multiple game systems. I believe it was for the PS4, Xbox One, and PC. So Square Enix may have shot themselves in the foot by making it a PS5 exclusive, but my guess is that they're probably going to. I mean, obviously, like the game is going to sell more with the inclusion of a PC version, but I don't get why they decided to keep it off the Xbox Series X. I mean, like Final Fantasy is probably a title that you would want on as many game systems as possible, especially now because Final Fantasy is starting to become like Resident Evil in the sense where people are more interested in like remakes or like spin-offs of the older games than they are in like the newer installments. And like for the most part, I feel like with Final Fantasy, it seems like if it's not anything related to Final Fantasy 7, it's mainly just like something new that people really don't care too much about. And I think one of the main issues with Final Fantasy as well is that in terms of like all the stories and all the entries, there's not really any continuity within any of the games because all like the main characters and the stories are like completely different from previous entries, and it's kind of hard to build something new and have new characters and all that stuff that people can get behind, especially when characters from like the older installments were popular, like Cloud Strife, Tifa Lockhart, and all that. Um, you know, like I feel like in terms of like character development, they were some of the best characters, along with like the Gull Wings from Final Fantasy X. And that's just the thing, you have like new characters in just about every entry of Final Fantasy, and either they're going to connect with the audience or they won't. In this case, I don't think the main character for Final Fantasy 16 necessarily connected with the audience to the same extent as the ones that I just mentioned from older entries within the series. But I think that's probably like the one of the biggest challenges of making a Final Fantasy game is coming up with a compelling story and a character that can connect with the audience. And I think at this point in terms of gaming, we're way past like trying to create like characters that can connect with people and character development and all that stuff. People care more about gameplay and whether or not they can relate to it and stuff like that, but it is what it is. And if you look at Final Fantasy 15, I think it managed to sell like 10 million units worldwide by the time spring of 2022 came up. So some people feel that you may have to give Square you may have to give Final Fantasy 16 a couple of years for it to reach the same level of sales as Final Fantasy 15, or even surpass it for that matter. But the thing is, if Final Fantasy 16 was as much of a deal or as much of a big deal as a lot of people said it was, then it definitely would have been way past 3 million, like right now. They would have been like past the 3 million mark a long time ago. And it doesn't seem like that's really much of the case as of late, because Square Enix have not necessarily come out and give us any updates on their sales. And I don't think at this point has even like reached, half of what Final Fantasy 15 has just yet. In fact, I think more people are going to be more interested in Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth next year than they're going to be in Final Fantasy 16. And I hate to say it, but I feel like people might forget about Final Fantasy 16 by the time we get to 2024, which is probably why they plan on like I heard they plan on like releasing like DLC or something like that, but don't take my word for it. It's just a rumor or whatever. But yeah, I feel like for the most part, Final Fantasy 16 is just like for a video game, like an RPG game, it's pretty good. It probably would have stood out and shined more if it came out in 2022, but 2023, not the best year to release this game. And a lot of people feel like this game probably ended up being more detrimental to Square Enix than it was beneficial in the long run.